I'm going to be talking a little bit about hunting threat actors, pivoting on threat actors, whatever you want to call it, with TLS certificates, how you can use open source data to do this and to also defend your networks. So real quick introduction, who I am. My name is Mark Parsons. In a previous life, I was an incident responder and network defender for a civilian government agency. I also spent some time as an occasional threat analyst. But now I'm actually a DevOps and intel person for a startup called Canadian Union. I'm also a victim of preconceptions of ransomware. So for those that were hard on the saw, I was the guy in the red shirt. So I also like to write in Python and sometimes in Golang. So one person I am not. Any fans of archery here?
Yeah.
Okay. So as you guys know, one of the lead animators, his name is Mark Parsons. Okay, kind of cool. Well, it's not cool for me because he also does fan fiction videos for One Direction. And I kind of have Mark Parsons at gmail.com and I get his fan mail. So, all of you whose kids want to be put in the videos, I cannot help you. Yeah. I could be vicious about it, but thankfully I haven't. So with that, I'm going to preface some of what I'm talking about real quick with some traditional methods of hunting or pivoting when you're looking for network-related resources. So first, passive DNS. So for those that may not be aware, maybe they don't do this very often, it's the idea of historical mapping of DNS addresses, or domains to IP addresses and IPs to domains. So the idea of, hey, what did CNN.com resolve to over the past 2 years? That way you can go historically where some domain actually resided on an IP address. I've listed here some sources for passive DNS. The first one's Farsight. They're probably the granddaddy of passive DNS. I actually believe Paul Dixie was one of the ones who actually wrote part of the spec for this whole idea about passive DNS. They have great data, it's just costly. Then there's Mnemonic. That's a group out of the EU. You can actually use their service. It's actually free. Then there's Passive Total. How many people in here have heard or have used Passive Total? Okay, cool. I'm a big fan of it. I'll see that throughout the slides. Two, you can use some of it for free for about 25 queries a day, but then you have to start to pay for it. And then there's OpenDNS. You can also buy their umbrella service. The other one is who is tracking. So the idea here is when you order a domain, or you buy a domain, you put in your name, your street, all that fun stuff. And if you don't hit the little privacy registration button, that data is stored in the who is record. Well, there are services that are listed down here, like domain tools, that when they see new domains, they're scraping all that data and they're stored in a big database that then they can sell for people to search and do some fun things with it. So the idea here is to be able to pivot on different parts of that data in a domain. So the registered name, my name is Mark Parsons, maybe I registered domain under my name, but then I send the email address to scottroberts@gmail.com. Well, I can say, let's show me any domains that use that email address. And a lot of threat intel people, they use this method for tracking new domains, new infrastructure. Well, the more we've talked about it, the harder it's gotten because the bad guys go, oh, I should just do the whole privacy registration thing, or I buy from a reseller. So it's a little bit harder for us to track that way, but you can still do it for some different intrusion groups. Again, I'm listing here some sources. Domain tools, again, probably the granddaddy of all of this. They're also the most expensive. There's a newer one called Whoisology. Again, Passive Total. Domain IQ, I've been playing with them a little bit recently. I don't know if you've got as much data as domain tools, but I think eventually they'll get there. But then the other one down here is Domain Big Data. This is all completely open source. It's free, you can do searches. They seem to have a decent amount of data. I really wish they would have an API. They haven't answered any of my emails yet asking for that. So that leads to another question. We have these two awesome data sources that provide us some pivotal or trackable data for tracking threat actors. But what else could we do? Is there another method? There is. There's TLS certificates. One quick caveat before I really get started. When I'm talking about TLS certificates, I'm not talking about code signing certificates. So code signing certificates, those are the ones that companies will go and they'll buy a certificate for their actual binary that you install on your computer. The idea behind a code signing certificate is to say, hey, no, this is legit, this came from me, and the software will not be modified unless we've got this cert going through it. Again, yes, I know code signing certificates are stolen, bad guys use them. I'm not talking about using those for tracking them in this talk. It can be done. That's a talk for a different day. But I am talking about the TLS certificate. This is network-related communications from one host to the other to say, yes, this is the host I'm supposed to talk to, and yes, we should do it over an encrypted channel. So if you start to do this and you start talking to your bosses, hey, I'm doing this TLS certificate hunting method, chances are they'll come to you with a code signing certificate and say, hey, can you track this down? Or some of your friends will. And you could spend some time and go like, well, is this code signing? I'm like, yeah. Like, sorry, I can't do that with this thing. Just keep that in mind. So some basics. Where can you get started? It's actually really easy. 2 basic searches to start with. An IP to a certificate, and a certificate to an IP. What do I mean by that? For instance, in this example, what certificates have been seen on this IP address? Well, this is one of my use cases. I'll go over that in a few minutes. And then, what IP address has this, or what IP addresses is this certificate currently being seen on? Again, this is depending on the service you're going to use, which I'll go over. I will cover this a little bit later. But one of the things to consider, or one of the things I think people should consider as you start to develop this method, is the first one is to look at the time frame that a certificate was seen on an IP address. And by that, I mean, let's say you're working on an intrusion, or someone wrote a blog post about something, and you look up the domain, you get the IP address, look at the IP address, oh, awesome, it's got 3 certificates. And you start working on the certificate, you pivot on that certificate, you find 6 more IP addresses. You get super excited, you think you found a ton of, or a good amount of infrastructure for you to monitor, maybe go back through your logs. But the problem is, you're dealing with something that was written about in 2016, and you found some certificates that were only active in November of 2013. This will happen. It will feel like a kick to the gut. Just be okay with it and move on. As you do this more, it'll start to become a lot easier on the second nature. One of the other things to consider is, was a certificate seen during a period of malicious activity? Did you actually see a TLS handshake on your network? Did you, of course, did someone share it with you? Hey, you saw this malware, it beaconed out over 443, it actually did a TLS handshake, here's the certificate. If you did, you're like, okay, that's legit. We know this is being used for command and control communications. So that gives you a little more confidence that what you're tracking down is actually something that you can pivot on. In some cases, the malware may actually have the certificate inside in the malware itself. That also helps you, and it also gives you additional places to pivot off of. Another one is how many other hosts have been seen using the certificate. I have one use case here where we're up to over 300. That's over a 3-year period. You'll come up 10, 15, 20, okay, not bad. Also look at how many hosts and what network blocks they ran. Are they across multiple network blocks? Are they all on one same network segment? If you get into the close to the thousands, chances are that it's not a certificate you want to be looking at. It's probably a default certificate, some sort of OS or some sort of embedded device, things like that. So start looking at accounts before you start going down a rabbit hole. The other one is to look at the expiration dates on the certificate. The key one there is most malware is not going to care about the expiration date, meaning when the certificate was signed. It says this certificate's good for 1 year. Most malware is going to say, oh, the certificate's expired. I'm not going to be able to exfil my data. Your browser's the one that really cares about that. Maybe some of your additional thin clients or thick clients, they may do that as well, but most malware is not going to. So keep an eye out for the expiration dates, especially if you're looking at phishing sites or credential harvesting sites. But if you see something that the certificate has expired, don't necessarily rule it out as a certificate for tracking. The other one is look at the issuer. Is it self-signed? If it is, chances are it's not going to be used for something like credential harvesting or trying to mimic your site. It's going to actually help you use for malware. Because again, it's your browser. If they're trying to get your credentials, they're going to want something your browser's going to accept. They're not going to want somebody who's, oh, please accept this. They're going to want to make it look as seamless as possible. If it's a free certificate, by free, I mean something like Let's Encrypt WooSign, StratCom. I think there's a couple others. Most of these are actually now trusted by the browser. So it's easy for a bad guy to go, oh, I want to set up a phishing site for credential harvesting, but I'm going to get a free certificate, so I don't have to spend any money. Then there's the paid certificates. There are cases where these certain intrusion groups or threat actors will use a paid certificate because they really want into your environment. They want it to look legit as possible. One quick thing, if you do have questions anytime, please feel free to interrupt me. So how can you use this for network defense? How many people here use Suricata or Bro for their networks? How many people here use Snort? Okay. So Suricata and Bro, very easy to pull TLS certificates into for alerting. Suricata is as simple as creating the rules as TLS fingerprint and then the SHA-1 hash of that certificate. Bro, even easier, using the threat intel framework, you just say SHA-1 and the SHA-1 certificate. And the nice thing with Bro, it'll find that certificate on any port. So if it's TLS on port 8443, Bro will find it because it actually looks at the protocols that are being used. Snort, I don't know the way you can do it in Snort. I gave this talk previously, and I asked, there was actually some Talos guys in the room. They didn't answer me, but some other guy said, you could actually run the Bro Snort plugin to have Bro create the Snort rules for you. For Snort 3, the Polish cert has actually created a package that you can pull into Snort 3, and it will allow you to add in TLS fingerprints. So you start pulling this data from monitoring, and it's great because you're pulling in one-time indicators, but how do you automate the tracking of these TLS certificates? For those that, like I said, I mentioned Pass and Total, they actually had a blog about this last week, about using their platform for tracking TLS certificates. I highly recommend you check it out. It allows you to automate a lot of this. I'm going to go over a website called census.io. Has anyone heard of Census? Yep, it's a great service. I imagine all of you have been scanned by Census almost on a daily basis. You have. It's very different than Shodan. You don't have to pay to get the access to Census if you do Shodan. But Shodan scans a lot more forms. So one of the things you can do with Census, I'll cover it later. If you get an account on the Census website as a researcher, you can actually get access to their API, and you can start scripting a lot of this to say, hey, these are certificates or IP addresses I'm interested in on a daily basis. Just dump all the certificates I'm interested in. Is anything else new? If it is, throw it into my alerting. You can also use your own local sonar. So sonar is scans.io. Anyone heard of scans.io? Okay. Rapid7, I'll put that. So you can download their data locally and ingest it in something like Elasticsearch or HBase or whatever system you want to use. Or you can be using actually a combination of all three of these. This is actually what I do. So what you can do is you can put all the IP addresses that you find, put it back into your monitoring for either your IDSs, your firewalls, wherever you can have network collection points. Or if you can be aggressive and actually block things, you can put these certificates in, or at least the IP addresses in, to block network communications. So let's talk a little bit more about some network defense. It's actually network hygiene. The first one is look at your net blocks. So if you're using the Elasticsearch version or Census.io, what I mean is you can take your ASN and throw it in the Census and say, hey, Census, what certificates have you seen in my ASN? So you can actually see what data does someone outside of my network see about my network. So it's a great way to say, oh, hey, I didn't know that service was open, or that service that I thought you had retired actually was never retired. It's a great way to get an idea of what's going on with your network. Here are some things I suggest you look for. Your security appliances. Unfortunately, a lot of security vendors, especially video appliance, they don't allow you to configure the TLS certificate that your service is using. So if you opened up your management portal because for some reason you want to connect to it without connecting to VPN, a lot of them have the same self-signed certificate. There's one vendor which I won't name, that's very bad for this. I can find all of their sandboxes around the world.
Game on.
It's FireEye. through back channels, we have reached out to them and said, hey, we can map out your entire customer list based using this method. Can you please at least allow your customers to change their TLS certificates? I think they allow you to do that now, but they don't really teach you how to do it. One of the things to look for is remote access management. Things like HP's integrated lights out, and those remote access card, or the Supermicro ITMI interfaces. You know, everyone's been a lazy admin. Like, I don't want to VPN. If I just need to reboot a box at 2 o'clock in the morning, I want to be able to do it through a clickable web interface. It's a great way to say, hey, do you have any of those actually available on your network that the internet can hit? I've actually used this one for websites or services you didn't know about. Again, I work for a large government agency. We did not have goods when I first started doing this, an idea of everything we had publicly available. So I was actually able to find, hey, here's all the websites that we have running TLS. So that we could actually say, these are ones that we need to make sure we're actually keeping an eye on. So you look inside your network blocks. Now let's look outside your network blocks. So look for certificates for your organization. I believe on the panel earlier, the gentleman from Walmart was talking about how some of his threat intel team can, I believe, find services that are being spun up using some stuff on the dark web. You can do the same thing here. If someone's developing a website for your organization, or they're starting to stand up stuff, maybe it's a dev or QA system, and they're just testing it, they put anything related to your org inside of it, you can potentially find it so you can be aware of it. Look for certificates that, when people register the certificates, they put email addresses for your org. I've seen cases where it's a developer, he's working on something at home on his free time, or their free time, but they use their corporate email address to actually create a certificate. It may not be related to your org, but it's at least something that maybe someone's doing something on your org's time. Then another one is look for certificates that have your organization in the subject alternate name. I want to go beyond just your org, anything with your org's infrastructure. A researcher that I collaborate with, a guy by the name of David Westcott, Beast Fighter on Twitter, he does a ton with this. He can map out a ton of people's internal infrastructure because they're using their own certificate authority to put TLS certificates on their websites, but they're also including wildcards for all of their corporate infrastructure. So he's been able to find LDAP servers, so IP addresses of LDAP servers, names of LDAP servers, all sorts of other different things that probably should not be public data. So from an offensive standpoint, if you had a search of red teamers, they could go, oh, look, here's all these servers on the inside that we don't have to scan your network for. We already have that data. So it's one of these things to start looking in certificates for stuff around your organization. The other is to look for doppelgangers. So when I talk about doppelgangers, classic google.com, look for 00 rather than 00. There's a couple cases, especially for credential harvesting, but trying to get into your org is a great way to slip by the analyst. I would also highlight take a look at passive levels keyword searching. So if you're using their API and you do a keyword, maybe it's your organization's name, maybe it's if your org has a particular acronym or abbreviation, use that as a keyword search. Using RiskIQ's data set, you can actually look for that keyword across DNS data, who is the TLS certificates, or the past DNS one. So for those that use domain tools, it's like domain monitoring, but on several more data points. So I've talked a lot about TLS certificates, what you can do, but I haven't talked about where you start. Well, first you need some data. Well, you could scan all of it, and that's where Sense.io and Rapid7 come in. So Scans.io is one of the data sources. I've actually created a set of Python scripts or Golang scripts that allow you to ingest their data and put it into Elasticsearch for you to pull in locally and search. You can use Census.io or Passive Total. So what is Scans.io? So these scans are performed by Rapid7. They have raw data going back to October of 2013. So now we're close to almost 3 years of historical TLS certificate data for the internet. It's easily consumable. They update them weekly. They tend to do their scans earlier in the week. It's very incremental in nature. So what I mean by that is the release for the files that I use. They provide a search.gz file. So if you think about an incremental backup, their file is, it's only the new certificates that they saw that week. Not everything they've seen previously, it's only the new stuff that week. So if you think about an incremental backup, it's only backing up the new stuff it sees. They provide the SHA-1 fingerprint and the actual raw base64 encoded certificate. Now their host.gz file, that is the SHA-1 and the host. That's a mapping, so it's a CSV of SHA-1 host, that's it, of everything they saw that week. Now, one of the issues is they don't have a public search interface that I'm aware of. And it's a weekly scan frequent enough. There are use cases, especially with things like DriveX, they're changing their certificates almost every 7 hours in some cases I've seen. So this method's not going to work for that. You maybe find a couple of pieces of infrastructure, but I leave that up to a decision for all of you. Is this type of weekly scan frequent enough? Then there's census.io. So this is a joint project with the University of Michigan. I listed on the Facebook website. It's University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. I've used this. It's been around since October of last year. What's interesting is census.io, all the University of Michigan scans, that's also on scans.io's website. Way back when Rapid7 first started doing this, University of Michigan was also doing similar scans. I think those guys talked together and said, hey, what if we have one place to put all this data? They created scans.io. Well, I think the researchers behind the University of Michigan team was like, oh, wouldn't it be great if this was all searchable? They got the free hosting from Google, so they can actually make census.io available. It is a very easy to use search interface. If you can do full text searching and type in different keywords, you can use their interface. They do have an API. If you register for a researcher account, you can get access to their API. I haven't hit the limit on that API yet. It's decent size. One of the other things that it gives you access to is their SQL interface. So they're using data, or Google's big data table for the backend. So with the SQL interface, you can actually query all of their historical data going back to at least October of last year. So it takes a little bit longer and you have to reparse the data, but it is there. Their scans are all or nothing. So what I mean by that, if there's any type of delta between scans, the old data is no longer the main search interface. So let's take the example of you stand up a website and you haven't put your company's TLS certificate on it yet. You're using the default one from whatever OS vendor you're using. And Census scans it today. You search their interface for your IP or your netbox, and you say, oh yeah, there's this new website. It's using the self-sign certificate. Let's say tomorrow your system's admins change the certificate, put in the new one for your corporate environment. Census scans it again. You'll see the new certificate. You will not see the old certificate in their main search interface. You can still find it in the SQL interface, but just keep that in mind when you're actually using Census. One of the other things you get with the API access, you get access to all the JSON from all the historical scans. Compressed, it's about 220 gigs on almost a daily basis. So it's a lot of data to pull down and ingest. The nice thing with it is it's already parsed. It has the IP addresses, all the certificates have been parsed, but also includes the raw certificate as well. So if you've got some developers, you can probably trim a large amount of that data out, and it won't be nearly that size in your data collection. So passive token. So I think this should be probably the first place for any new teams that don't already have a passive data capability, meaning you don't already have Farsight or you don't have all these different data sources. The team behind passive total knows what it means to be an analyst. They've tried to build a platform that allows analysts to quickly get to data and try to figure out what's going on. So they've merged a lot of the traditional hunting methods that I've talked about, the passive DNS, the who is. They also do these TLS certificates. The other nice thing is they do open source reporting. So if CrowdStrike, FireEye, or some Joe Smo happens to write a blog about something they see, and they index it, and it shows them what something you search, will actually show up on the OSN tab. and you can actually get some context about what you're looking at. A lot of places don't have that, and they don't have that capability in-house. There's a ton more data that I'm not even touching the surface that you can do with Fast and Total. So if you're not using it, I suggest you try it with one disclaimer. They did provide good researcher access for the data required for this presentation, so take that under advisement. I am a fanboy, but it's because I like your service. So let's start with some basic examples, real basic, of using Fast and Total, Census.io, or your own local Sonar data store. So my example from earlier, what certificate's been seen on this IP address? Well, this is a stripped-down version of Fast and Total, and as we can see here, this certificate has been seen on this address, but it's also been seen on 6 others. I'm actually going to go over this use case in a little bit. The nice thing is you can also see the range and the certificate seen on that IP address. So that certificate was seen for 7 months. Census. Where is this certificate currently seen according to Census? Again, where Census is more closer to real time, this is great to see is this operational now. In this case, there's these 2 IP addresses. I will go over again this slide later. Hopefully some people will recognize those IPs, or that if not, you will see. Another one is, I'm using the ASN name of Amazon, but show me everything that's in an ASN that has the word Amazon and is self-signed. Meaning, is it just something new that someone stood up, or just an interesting way to look at the Census.io interface. In this case, you can see there's roughly 156,000 TLS certificates in Amazon's ASN that are self-signed. This was a little harder to see, but this is using my local Sonar data repository. And I said, show me anything that was signed by WuSign, which is one that is a Chinese certificate authority that offers free certificates, that had the word Microsoft in the subject. So in this case, there's 2. Login Microsoft Online at us.com and officers Microsoft.com. I'm pretty sure the second one's been used in phishing campaigns by an agency. I'm not positive on that, but I'm pretty sure that was used by a particular person. So now that you've seen some very basic examples, let's go ahead and actually do some hunting activity. So let's get aboard the train. This is the first use case I ever did with this method. A really smart analyst I used to work with, he was digging on this one day. I said, hey, Mark, have you seen this Sonar, the scans.io stuff? I'm finding some stuff in this data, but it's taking me forever to Z-grep through all this data. So maybe we can speed this up. Well, I was doing some things like parallel Z-greps, which started a little bit, but once we really started to look at the data, like, oh, this would be great if it was searchable, because there's so much more we can do with it. So in this use case, in 2014, Microsoft came out. There was a 0 data that was being used in the wild. There was a remote code execution in work. What was awesome about this, TechNet, Microsoft posted an awesome blog. One of the things, they provided Yara stakes. Anyone here use Yara? Cool. So this was something very actual that I think it's one of the first times I've seen Microsoft actually use Yara stakes in the reporting. It allows for network defenders to pull in and validity search their binaries if they had stuff like that. It provided a TLS certificate and provided a command and control IP and a potential domain. The way they worded it was kind of funny. So that's why it says potential command and control. But let's look at that from a quick graph. So again, top the TechNet advisory, the domain, the TLS certificate, and the IP address. So let's do some traditional pivots. Traditional pivots meaning past DNS. So what IP address has this domain been seen on? What domains have been seen on the IPs? And if we have who is data on that domain, let's do a pivot on that. Repeat those 2 steps for anything, and you get something like this. So these 3 indicators here are the initial ones from TechNet. We can see that domain that they provided was registered by this Philip Zana at yahoo.com, which also registered these 2 other domains. That domain, activecontent.tv, happened to also be on the IP address that was in the Microsoft blog. Okay, great. Well, we can also see This IP was the IP that domain was resolved into at the time of the Microsoft blog. And then we pivot again on this active news info, find a new IP. So basically, this domain and this IP were completely new because we did the Wiz pivot. What if we take the TLS certificate and pivot on it? Oh, these three IPs in the middle, they're completely new. We had no way of knowing that. So we now have gone from a series of one domain, one IP, one TLS certificate, to we now have 3 domains and 6 TLS certificates. So from a network defense standpoint, as a defender, I go, awesome. That gives me more data for me to search through. Say, hey, did I have any communications? Or this is something that's ongoing. I can throw this into my monitoring and either release an alert or block mine. So I want to show a quick timeline of what this data looks like. Everything's grouped by the IP address. So there's 6 columns, 6 different IPs. And what you can see is the first IP, that one was actually seen for about 14 months, meaning it was on that IP for 14 months. So the analyst may think that was probably operational for 14 months. The second one, that was actually the one in the Microsoft blog. If you see here, that little blue dot represents when the Microsoft blog came out. The next week, that certificate was not seen. Or one more week, and then the certificate was no longer seen on that IP address. So obviously, I'm assuming the threat actor behind this, my assumption is they saw this, or they started seeing researchers poking at their system, and they said, oh, let's burn this one to the ground. You can also see there was this one other IP. It was only on there for 2 or 3 months. My guess is probably a staging or a testing site. And then it was showed up on this one day, and this was the actual domain that Microsoft submitted. But what's interesting is basically the week after it stopped showing up on the other IP, it basically showed up on 2 more, and it was operational for about 6 months or 4 more months. So it's the same SHA-1. Yep, this is all the same SHA-1. So this certificate was seen on all 6 IP addresses. So the idea behind this timeline is to have a graphical representation rather than looking at a Maltego graph. To actually look at it not in a tabular format, but almost like in a swim lane. So for me, this was a success. Again, we've gone from 1 IP, 1 domain, 1 TLS certificate, to 6 IPs, 3 domains. And using some basic registration info, we were able to do some pivoting. Pretty sure this is what we did when we figured this out, just not as smooth as that. So another use case, Palo Alto's low-dose velocity report. This is a report, I believe, from last year, around this time of year, maybe a little earlier. This report was actually fantastic. It's about a group that targets Hong Kong, Taiwan, Vietnam, Philippines, and Indonesia, mainly Southeast Asia, using open source names, the Elite Trojan. What was great is they provided a CSV of IOPS on GitHub. If you're a threat intel vendor and you're doing reporting, please do us all a favor. If we're not using your platform, make the IOPS available on something like GitHub so that we can actually clone your repositories and pull the data down. Or as the guy from Walmart said, GitHub is basically baked in. So, I'm just going to pivot on their initial IP indicators in their blog post. Thank you. And you can see here that initially they had 34 IPs. Well, I looked up all those IPs and said, how many of those have TLS certificates? Several of them did. It's kind of hard to show on the graph, so I kind of tried to change the view so you can see using Maltego, the bigger the bubble, the more links coming back into it. There were several. So I go, several of those are using the same cert. Could there be more? Well, it's kind of hard to see. Right here, there's, you can see, that's 300 different IP addresses that have been seen with the certificate on it. Actually, I think it's closer to 320 now. This was as of last week. So, yeah, there's a lot more. So yeah, as of the 15th. What's interesting about this, it is self-signed. The issuer and the subject are all the same. It's Eric's office. I don't know if this was actually from Eric's office. I have no idea. But what's interesting about this one is it was created on February 13th, 2012. Now, I haven't gone back to look at older of these samples to see if any of this also called out the IPs that maybe had this reference to it. Unfortunately, we don't have all the data to go back to that time frame, but I'm going to guess is this has been used for more than since October 30th of 2013. So yeah, it's still very active today. Again, it's been based on sonar data. We've seen from October 30th through this week. So APT28 and SOPC. Has anyone heard of this group before? No? Has anyone heard about the DNC pack? Okay. So last year, a German newspaper came out with this awesome article about attacking their parliament. A lot of it, they gave a lot of the research data out that said, hey, this is actually not that's being used. They provided several indicators. They provided domains and a couple IPs in the TLS. For the first one, QOD.al. Does anyone know what that actually is? It's a doppelganger of the Albanian government. It's not GOD, it's QOD. This is a supposed Russian organization or nation state group. They probably want to try to do some things with the Albanian government. So if we take the domains that were provided and we pivot on them, we get that QAB.al pointing to this one IP address that was in the report, and then we find 5 more IP addresses. A couple of them, again, are QAB.al, so obviously it would appear some sort of targeting on the Albanian government. The other one is this mailphoto.com. Doing some Googling, the PHO, my assessment of this is the PHO stands for the PHO office in the Kherson region of Ukraine. It's actually some sort of legal office in the Kherson region of Ukraine, which is the territory in Ukraine that's just north of Crimea. This data was seen within a few months of Russia's annexation of Crimea. Again, the speculation that was probably targeting someone within Ukraine because that was something of interest possible to this group. So we take that TLS certificate and we pivot on it, or we take the IP address and we pivot on it, and we get 2 TLS certificates. Let's take a look at the first one. Does anyone know what VK or login.vk.com probably is? Does anyone know what vk.com is? It's Russian's version of Facebook, basically. So that's interesting. Why was the certificate seen on an IP address that was related, that was in a report about the German government being hacked by this group? Something interesting. This is the only IP address that's surfacing on, by the way. And then there's this one. 454 reverse-cookservers.net. Yes, that is legit. That is an actual ISP or a hosting provider on Crook servers. That domain was listed in the German newspaper report. This is a certificate of area of interest. So let's pivot on. We're now up to, actually, this is outdated as of yesterday. We wrote the two more IP addresses. This IP is the actual IP that this threat actor group, their malware is called X tunnel. This certificate is seen in a large amount of their external samples, not all of them, but a large amount of them. So all these, to my knowledge, most of these IPs have been used in campaigns using this malware. What's interesting, 2 of those IPs were listed by CrowdStrike, and they came out on the breach. That's the same group, same malware. These IPs were listed in the report. I had them on my internal database months before the CrowdStrike report came out. I didn't know it was related to the DNC, I just knew this group was using it. So let's take a little timeline of how long the certificate has been seen, again, group by IP. So I know it's very hard to read I kind of wanted to show the breadth of how long this has been used. In some cases, it's been used for several months. Right here, right here.
They're the same shot one again.
Yep, all of these are the same shot one. Everything in yellow is the same shot one.
What's the overall amount of time on your graph?
From March of 2015 through Monday of this week. What's interesting is these two IPs right here. They were in the Information Department report, so they were obviously stopped. They stopped using it well before the report came out. But the one at the very top, it was still being used. Don't know where, who was the victims, and then again down here. We don't know if it's used for quite some time. And then this one here were the CrowdStrike reports. What's interesting about those, you don't see them show up basically the same day the CrowdStrike report comes out. When you read the CrowdStrike report, they say we got them off the network. It was a weekend-long thing. Chances are the adversary, I'm guessing, I was not involved in that. Saw all of that and was like, okay, we don't need to use these systems anymore. You're made. So, pivoting from the German Parliament report, two domains, two IPs, one TLS certificate. The traditional pivots found as 5 interesting domains. We're now up to 24 IPs, 7 domains, 3 TLS certificates that we can monitor. There are additional linkages to several of these IPs in open source reporting. PwC had a report back last June that listed a couple of domains. One of those domains showed up on one of those IPs around the same time, and FireEye also had a similar report. So basically, if you aren't monitoring the certificate, you probably should. So this one's a fun one. PwC's Polish red team. So PricewaterhouseCoopers, I happened to come across some of their infrastructure. So the way I found this was on a private mailing list I'm on. Someone shared several malicious hashes. And what was interesting about this that piqued my interest was in several cases this malware, once it was established, once it was installed and running, it was doing DNS tunneling for command and control. Well, I've seen some DNS tunneling in some other engagements that I worked on. And I was like, okay, let's see how some other people are doing it. I didn't know who this was related to, what it was doing. I just thought it was interesting. So these are the 5 initial hashes. All 5 of them, the command and control pointing back to this, I can't pronounce it, something .pl domain. I'm like, okay, let's start pivoting on that. So pivot on that, find 5 IP addresses. These are just passive DNS lines. Nothing super high tech. So then, doing passive DNS on all those IPs, you get a ton more domains. Things like salarybenchmark.com, a couple others that kind of looked interesting. I kept digging on it a little bit further. There was one malware hash over here. Excuse me. That hash right there was seen on this domain, which was also seen on 2 of those IPs. So maybe think, hey, this is something going on here. I would start to think that this infrastructure was all related. So I took it a step further, and I did a certificate on all those IP addresses, and I find 3 certificates. This is a little hard to read, so I'm going to summarize it. Well, first let's look at the 3 certificates. The first one is actually a certificate for the domain that was in the initial samples I looked at. So I have a domain that I knew was malicious because I had malware hashes that were calling out to it. I have a certificate that has that name in the subject. Chances are they're definitely related. Another certificate for vouchersforyou.net. Interesting. Again, it's a purchase certificate. So maybe it's something legit, who knows. Third one, this is a self-signed certificate. Internet Widgets, PTY Ltd. Anyone who's done an OpenSSL certificate for Apache or Nginx is basically the default cert, or at least the default entries. They've obviously changed the practice. So when we pivot on the newly discovered TLS certificates, we basically find a couple more domains, a couple new IP addresses. Again, hard to read. So we found 3 new IPs. So if you look back at my certs, I'll post the links later. The first cert we looked at was seen on all 5 original IPs that I found, including passive DNS lookups, and it was also seen on 1 new IP. Cert 2 was seen on 4 of the 5, and it was also seen on 2 additional IPs. Same thing with Cert 3. So we've gone from, I've pivoted through all this, and I find basically 3 more IPs that are part of their infrastructure. And the way I actually found that was their infrastructure, one of the IPs, if you do an ASN lookup, it actually said PwC Poland. That's how I knew it was them. Well, the second way I knew it was them. The first one was on the malware hashes. Unfortunately, the pen tester's metadata was in the hash, and I had his full name. So I want to caveat this. I could have found all of this infrastructure without doing the certificate pivoting. All of it, but if you keep doing a couple more pivots, you find all of it using passive DNS. So I didn't need to do TLS certificates in this case, but I wanted to do it because it helps connect the dots. It shows the relations that, hey, all of these are related. Obviously, it's infrastructure that is being used. So with that, I want to say one quick thank you to the PwC Poland Red team for being good sports about it and letting me mention this to their public, my talk. My last example is Poseidon. Point of sale, malware. The TLS group did a fantastic blog on this a year ago. They provided some initial indicators based on the different, 3 different malware pieces that are being used by Poseidon. Doing passive DNS on all the domains, you basically, all the IPs resolve some of the domains in the report and additional IPs. It's a little hard to see in the graph, but there's nothing that's outlined, meaning all the domains resolved from an IP or all the IPs pointed back to some domain that was in the report. So they're all linked in some fashion. So we pivot on the TLS certificate, again, very hard to read because it's hard to do my previous round screenshots in a small browser window. There's 3 little clusters at the bottom, all of new IPs that are related to the TLS certificates. So let's take a look at those certificates. Does anyone see anything in common with all 3 of those certificates? So yeah, the certificate, the issuers are all the same. It's a self-signed certificate, but all 3 of them have the same validity length. They're all 2,000 days. The certificate's valid for 2,000 days. That's a pretty uncommon time frame for a self-signed certificate. Based on some of the data searches I did, I think when I originally did this last summer, I think I found about 150 certificates out of the I think about like at that point I looked at 62 million certificates. So a very small percentage have a time limit of 2,000 days. So I look at this and I'm like, okay, look, they're all the same self-signed. They all have 2,000 days as their length. They're all been seen on IPs that I can point back to from an open source reporting. They're probably related. So let's zoom in on each one of those. So again, I try to show how their initial reason to show which ones were in reporting or at least available for passive reporting, passive hookups. So here on the right are all the domains that were in the Talent report. Some of them connect back to IPs that were also in the Talent report. So basically, everything from here over was found via Talent reporting. Everything else to the left, everything from here over, Palos, everything to the left was found via TLS certificates. So if I was protecting something that had point of sale, I would try to find anything that had TLS certificates traffic or block all those IPs. Most of them are probably not in places my point of sale system should connect to. Same thing with certificate number 2, just a much smaller cluster. This is a newer cert. It was based on one IP, showed up in that certificate, and we had 10 more. Same thing with number 3. This one looks very similar to the first one. One IP was the initial indicator, and then we've added probably 15 to 20 more. So with that, we started with 18 domains, 6 IP addresses, doing basic passive DNS pivots, added 29 new IP addresses, doing a TLS certificate pivot, you get 3 new certs. Pivoting on that, you have 51 new IP addresses. Again, from a network defense standpoint, I think this is something that's very useful from, let me go to my logs, for this into monitoring, and something to keep an eye on so that you can improve your network defense posture. There is much more to dig into. Team Kumra did a blog post about the same thing. They provided additional malware hashes. I didn't pull them in and to link them up to this. I'll leave that up to an exercise for everyone else to try. And then, quick summary. I think TLS certificate or SSL certificate pivoting for your network infrastructure allows you to look for additional data sources from a threat intelligence standpoint. Or at least, like we talked about earlier in one of the talks, there's probably one guy on your team who's an IR person and maybe does a little bit of threat intel when they have the time. This is something they can use to help keep an eye on some infrastructure that they're really interested in. Allows you to focus it for network defenses. Again, if you're using Gross or Kata, very easy to do. I highly suggest you look at those 2 systems to do that with. And then again, just using open source data outside of passive total, if you want to use it, that's the only one you have to pay for. You can do all of this using open source and not having to pay for it, other than the resources to download the data and put it. But I imagine most places can probably do that. Maybe you can't store it all, but you can probably store the last 6 months. So it's at least a place to start. And with that, I can pivoting. I'll open up to any questions. Yeah.
So, what would be the motivation for running some infrastructure on TLS and using that TLS?
Well, in some cases, it works. I mean, if it's going to continue to work, it's going to continue to use it. To the point where it's no longer I'm having issues getting it into someone because they're monitoring that certificate. I'm not, at least if I was an attacker, I'd probably prefer it if I didn't have it. At least that's my assumption. The idea behind this, again, like I mentioned earlier, is more we talk about like who is tracking bad guys figure, oh, I need privacy registration. They may see more people doing this, and then they go, oh, okay, we're going to have to start changing our certs more frequently. But until I actually think people can actually make an impact from a network defense standpoint, we probably won't have to. Yes.
Where will the slides be online? Because we have about 30 people online.
I will post that later. I will send out a tweet. It will be on my GitHub that I. Yes.
So there have been a number of adversaries that use stolen code signing certificates to get binaries into places.
Yep.
Have you identified stolen SSL certs being used as part of campaigns like that?
Yes, I have. Well, maybe not stolen. I don't have proof that said. So Scott's question, if there's it in here. I referenced earlier that people are stealing code signing certificates to get binary in basically time malware so that will run on operating systems. Yes, if I've seen any examples of that being done for TLS certificates. I have seen TLS certificates being mimicked for public organizations. I don't have proof that the actual certificate was stolen, because I haven't validated that that certificate was valid. But anyone can still up a certificate and make it look like it was something. But I have seen those cases. I haven't gone down into the weeds to say, yeah, this is actually a stolen certificate. But I have seen some use cases mimicking larger websites. Okay, any other questions? Cool. Thank you.